Let's get this show on the road. Started off by designing the falchion based off of other artists' renditions of the sword and basic sword drawings from D&D handbooks. This one is majorly inspired by Galactic Jonah on Twitter. Go follow him, he's cool. I divided it into 3 different sections so that I can easily transfer the measurements and make sure that it's a reasonable size. Next, onto the pattern. I rolled out a sheet of tracing paper and then measured it at 31 inches, which is the approximate size I wanted this sword to be. I then divided it into 3 different sections so that it would be in proportion with my sketch. Then I folded it in half and started sketching the design, flipping it back and forth to make sure that certain parts of it were symmetrical. This is where the tracing paper comes in handy because I can see what I did on the other side. This only applied to the hilt and then parts of the thing. And there's our pattern. Yay! Now onto the foam. So off camera, I cut out my pattern and adjusted the swirly bits a little bit. I looked at it and realized they were a little bit off. And I wrote down some foam measurements on the back just so I could keep it organized in my brain. So first, I grabbed a giant sheet of 4mm EVA foam that I got from TNT Cosplay Supply, and I weighed down my pattern and started sketching it out with a silver sharpie. I just sketched in a rough line for where it would meet with the hilt, and then I did it again. Next, using the smallest space I could to save as much foam as possible, I did the same thing with the handle, I think it's a pommel. And then on some 10mm EVA foam, I traced out the hilt 2 times. I also labeled the top so that the swirls wouldn't get me confused. Next, I cut it all out using a sharpened Xacto blade. Make sure that when you're cutting out EVA foam, you're holding the blade as perpendicular as possible to the cutting surface, or else you'll get janky angles. Also, if you're cutting thick EVA foam, you might need to do a couple of passes through the foam. That will keep your blade from dulling and will prevent you from getting any torn edges from forcing the foam. Cutting out the 10mm EVA foam took a long time, so I grabbed my little sharpening brick and I just sharpened my Xacto blade. This will help you save money also. Gotta be thrifty. I forgot to draw out this tiny little diamond piece, so I'm doing that now on 1 sheet of 10mm EVA foam. I'm only doing this once because there's no reason for me to double it. Then on some 2mm EVA foam, I'm cutting out a diamond shape to lay on top of it with a little diamond cut out of the middle. Now I've got all the pieces. Woo! So off camera, I drew some center lines and some arrows on my pieces and labeled them A and B, A being the top piece and B being the bottom piece. And I got these wooden skewers from my kitchen, and I'm going to use these as support beams through the sword. Usually you would want to use a wooden dowel or an aluminum rod or dowel, but for this, since I'm not taking it to a convention, I'm just using stupid little skewers. Next, I started digging a trench out of the B side of my foam pieces. I'm only doing one side because the dowels are so thin. This will help your foam sandwich it completely. Think of it like you've got 2 loaves of bread, and instead of it just being a normal sandwich, you want it to be like an Uncrustable sandwich. So both of the edges just like they meet, and you get a beautiful little unhealthy kindergarten sandwich. Make sure as you're cutting it, your foam doesn't get too thin. And now on to the glue. I got this little squeezy bottle and I poured some Weldwood contact cement glue into here. I found a little piece of scrap foam. I started squeezing out glue onto the pieces. Less is more when it comes to contact cement, even though you may not think so. So scrape off any of the excess you have. Make sure you don't miss the edges, because when you're routering those edges, they will have a tendency to peel up from each other. So just pay extra attention to them. Now I let it dry and get a little tacky, and then I push the dowel in. I took more glue and started to lay it on the top edge of the handle to connect to the next pieces, because we don't want any gaps. I pressed them together and then proceeded to add glue on the rest of the pieces. Making sure it's all lined up, and yay! For the blade, I did the same thing, adding glue to the edges so that there wouldn't be any gaps in between all the different pieces. And this was when I realized it was a little too floppy. So I started to add more wooden dowels, and since these pieces are wide enough and the foam is thin enough, I didn't need to dig any more trenches out of my pieces, so then I just added contact cement. I cut one of the dowels in half to use as support for the joint in between the longer pieces of wooden dowel, just so that it would have more resistance. And then I put contact cement on the rest of the piece. For this piece, since it's so long, I decided to go in smaller portions, so I did a little bit, went back and put more glue on, laid it down, put on more glue, and so on and so on. Now it's time to shape the foam. I'm using a rotary tool to do this, so to avoid ingesting any gross black dust, I'm wearing a respirator just in case, and of course, eye protection. I usually keep my rotary tool or Dremel on speeds 10 and 15. I started by smoothing out the handle of the sword, and then I did the same with the hilt. I didn't want it to get too round because even though they are weird tentacle shapes, I want them to still read as metal. So I'm leaving them as like rounded square shapes, if that makes any sense. Probably not. Then I tried to get this little bit right here, and to reach it, I extended my Dremel bit by unlocking it and just moving it up a little bit. Then, keeping in mind where the two layers meet, I slowly started taking away material at an angle. I started to smooth out the edges around the entire blade, and then I started actually taking away a bulk of the material. Now we're going to try to get these little details on the hilt. I'm using a very small bit for my rotary tool. Being careful to not rip the material with the small pointy bit, I slowly did it. On all four sides. I then used the same bit to clean up some of the smaller corners and edges. I cut out these strips of 2mm EVA foam to imitate leather wrapping around the pommel. I did the gluing process the same way I did the gluing for everything else. Less is more! Then once I got to the end, I cut an angle on the piece so that it would lay flat. And there's your fake leather material. Woo! Here's where it gets really messy. I started actually digging into the material with my rotary tool on speed 15 so that I could get the angles correct. And here it is after the blade was completely sanded down. Next, I took some scrap EVA foam and traced the shape of the eye onto two pieces so that I could glue it onto the sword. Fun fact, if you use a silver sharpie and then sandwich it, it transfers! I cut them out, sanded them, and then did the detail work. Here are the two eyeballs after I added all the details. And then using more scrap foam, I cut out tiny little bits that would soon become the barnacles on the sword. I added little geometric holes to each one just to make them look a little bit more like barnacles, but I didn't spend too much time on this. Next, I laid the pattern over the sword to find the general location of both of the eyes, and then I glued them on. Next, I took a scrap piece of 2mm EVA foam, and I started cutting out the eyelids for the piece. I wanted it to look like it was kind of bulging out of the sword in a really gross way. I also sanded the edges of the 2mm EVA foam so that it would lay as flush with the material as possible. I glued it down and then I messed with the shape of the actual eyelid opening for a while. And there it is! Next I sanded all of the small little barnacle pieces and then glued them on one by one. I sketched out some wave detailing on the blade. Then, using the same Dremel bit as earlier, I started to gently carve in the swirl designs on the blade. After everything was sanded, I used a heat gun to seal the foam. This gets rid of all of the little sandy bits all over the sword, and it helps it take the paint better. Doing this makes the foam shrink though, so this is where you would have problems with gaps in where two foam pieces meet. After I heat sealed it, I used something called Quick Seal, which is a bathroom grout filler. With a little bit of water, I went through and filled all of the gaps that may have been formed. Next, on to the paint. For primer, I used 3 generous coats of Plastidip, letting it dry in between every layer. Once it was all dry, I brought it to my spray booth in my room, which is basically just a giant cardboard box I set on my desk. For the paint, I started by applying the basic colors first. I wanted the blade to have a bit of a bluish tint, so I mixed some blue with an aluminum color. It doesn't show too obviously, but I think it helped in the long run. Then I painted the hilt of the sword with a greenish tinted metallic color so that it would look kind of worn, maybe oxidized, and also it just fits the color scheme of the sea, so you know, artistic license, it's fine. Next I painted the leather with a reddish-brown color paint. Then I started adding yellows and oranges to the eyes. I went back and touched it up later off camera, so what you see here isn't what the end result is necessarily gonna look like, but it's similar. Then I started adding shading in the little twisty bits. And a little bit under the eye. I added some softer shading around different parts of it to make it look a little bit dirtier and more worn. I also added dark brown shading to the leather. I sprayed a thin layer of bronze paint over the tops of the hilt to give it a sickly gold highlight. Next I added shading to the blade following all of the curves and where the shadows would naturally fall. I also put shading in places where there might not necessarily really be shadows, but since this isn't real metal, it needs a little bit of help to make it look like a 3-dimensional piece. Then I added shading to the wave detailing that I did earlier. And then gave the blade some highlights. I was running out of time for this build, so I decided to do all of the barnacles and the rest of the eye detail off camera. Then I started getting into the nitty-gritty detail work. Once the paint job was done, I took it out to my garage and sealed it with a sealing spray. And there it is! Now you have your very own sword of fathoms. Let me know if this was helpful and if there's any more weapons or cool props you want me to make. Have any questions, let me know in the comments. Also, if you end up using this tutorial or if it's helpful to you at all, send me a picture of your final product. I really want to see what you guys make. Or if you're just watching for fun, that's cool too. Hopefully I'll be able to put out more videos like this, but college is a lot, so it may be a while. But thanks for watching anyways, because was fun. Now you're one step closer to releasing an imprisoned demigod from the deep. Thanks for watching, and is it Thursday yet?